Hello everyone, welcome to our session with Chandreyee Lahiri, who won third place in the Tagore Award for Translated Fiction for her translated story The Return. Congratulations, Chandreyee.
Thank you, Vishwadeep.
Chandreyee, the question that I'll start with, I know that you are a writer yourself. So recently, your story, Dumbachara, was selected in a one city, one story contest in the Boston city. And it has been quite acclaimed and a lot of discussion was going on. So I think you are a writer first. Then why did you take up translation?
That's a great question. I think because, interestingly, my story that won this honor and that is being read widely in the greater Boston area is also a story based in, about Bengali culture, based in the Sundarban area. And I think that maybe that's really what inspired me to try translating, because even though my One City, One Story was in English, I feel like I was translating there too. I was translating a culture to bring it to American mainstream. And the interesting thing is I actually cannot read Bengali. I didn't grow up in India, and I know some of my Bengali alphabet, but I don't know it well enough to read any Bengali literature in the original. So I value translations extremely highly. And in fact, I've read a lot of translations of respected Bengali works. And I found myself thinking a lot about what makes for a good translation, because unfortunately, most that I have read have not been very good. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what makes for a good translation. And after bringing a story about my culture to the greater Boston area, it was a why not kind of a moment. Like, why not? Why shouldn't I go one tiny step farther and bring an actual Bangla story to an English reading audience? So I think I was emboldened. I finally found some confidence to give this a try.
That's great. I mean, your translation was really good, right? And I very much appreciated. And the fact that you are trying to transport Bengali story into the world of English literature, and while being judged by people who don't read Bengali as such, it still attained their attention as well as appreciation, which is really great. But having said so, now that you are a writer, also you are a translator as well. Which one will you like to focus more?
That's a good question. I'm actually also a storyteller, and I found myself torn in all the different directions. I'm very new to translating. The Return is my first attempt ever at translating, and I'm enthralled by it. I cannot wait to do more. Right now, though, I'm trying really hard to focus on some of my own fiction writing, compiling an anthology of short stories and flash fiction. I also have some narrative nonfiction that's come about mainly through my storytelling, through many years of storytelling. So I think I'm going to try and focus on that, but translation was just so stimulating that I think I'm going to start working on something else too. I have to say it was a really fascinating process, and maybe because I've thought about it before, maybe because I've read translations of Bangla, and I can almost hear what the original must have sounded like, and I can feel what is lost in translation even without reading the original Bangla. I think now, and having done it once before, I think I have a slightly better idea of how to go about it the next time. Interestingly, I feel like the translating has in some ways, I hope, made me a better writer. It took every skill I had to actually understand the original, to not just, it's very easy to translate a sentence from Bangla into English and get the words right or get the sentence structure right. What's extremely elusive is the tone and the mood, and more important than everything else is the subtext. As a writer, I know that I'm always trying to evoke a certain kind of impression, or I'm trying to suggest things between the lines. And understanding that takes an understanding of the culture. It takes an understanding of the craft with which the Bangla was written. And then understanding is like climbing a hill. And then when you get to the summit, then it's now translating it into English, but the English must be as melodious or as lyrical or as staccato, whatever the tone of the original was. And in doing all of that, I think it's really made me practice my own writing voice better. It's made me think harder about the stories that I read. And really, just with translation, I feel like I had to read every sentence 5 times over and read the whole paragraph to understand its context. So I'm sorry, you asked me what I wanted to do next, and it sounds like I do want to do some translating next, but yeah.
That's great. I mean, the way you explained is really fascinating. The process and the depth that a translator has to go into in somebody else's thought and mind, right, to transport it.
Right.
Even then, what we have often seen that some stories are fiction, which is great in its own language, doesn't transcend well when it goes into another language. So that means selection of a story that we want to do for translation is also immensely important. So how did you choose the story, and what is the process you may have gone through in thinking about the story that you want to translate?
Yeah, thank you. So this particular story in Bangla, it's titled Fira. So I actually picked 2 stories to translate. One was set in America. One was set in Fira was set in India. I was really more drawn to Fira, the one that ended up placing well in the contest. The reason I picked both of these is that the themes in them were universal, and context was not key. This exact same story that the writer wrote, that Mohua Shen Mukhopadhyay wrote about in Fira, you could have placed that in Mongolia and it would have still worked. The locations would have been different, the settings would have been different. So I think the universality of the theme spoke to me for both the stories that I chose to translate. Also, honestly, the style. Mohua has an incredibly, to me, she's got a very sensory, visual way of writing. A lot of people are good with imagery. A lot of people know the craft of writing well enough to say, oh, make sure you have some sight and some sound and some smell. A lot of people very deliberately craft their work to make it seem real and immediate and evoke senses in people. But Mohua does it very, very subtly and by evoking emotion. So I just found it absolutely marvelous. And this story that I picked over a lot of others that I have heard and know of, I can't read Bangla, so she reads them and I hear the recording. And there's many of her stories that I've read many, many times. But the reason this really, really called out to me is just it's a deep, deep dive into the internal monologue in a dying brain. And that is something that I have never experienced before. That the first time I heard that story, it imprinted on me in a way that I know that I'll never forget it. Anytime I think about the end of life, I'm going to know, or I'm going to wonder if that's what it's like. Is that what flashes through your mind? In English, there's this saying, right? Like my whole life flashed before my eyes in the few seconds preceding death. But the author here deals with it with such subtlety and grace and sensuality almost. It's almost like if the protagonist was not in the last few moments of her life, it would almost seem like she was luxuriating in all the senses that were firing one last time. And there's something just absolutely, I know it's morbid, but there's something utterly enthralling for me that I think transcends culture, it transcends setting. Even the way Mohan describes the buildings and the weather, it's very quintessentially Kolkata in many, many ways. But I found that translating it into English, again, because of if she had spent a lot of time just describing things, maybe it would have been harder. It would have been easy to translate, but it would have been harder to grip readers. But she chose not to spend as much time on physical description as on emotion, on the emotions they evoked. So I felt like that was something I could wrap my hands around, that I could translate. I could give just enough pointers so that people could draw a sketch in their mind of Kolkata. But really it was, so I would say it's her story and the universality of it and the sensuality of it and the poetry in it that made me think that this is something I can really flex my muscles around and use my powers of expression and my powers of poetic writing to evoke it. And it was utterly satisfying in a way that a mystery wouldn't have been.
In fact, while describing you, you told poetic, and there is one of the judges, I think, mentioned that this was the most poetic story that was received in the competition, and that they have looked through, and they thought translating that poetic prose is one of the most difficult thing to accomplish, and you did that, and that's really great. So definitely with your translation, I mean, as we look at how the Bengali language, Bengali literature can reach the world, and your translation can contribute to that, and that's exciting. So with that, I will just ask you one last question, Chandreyee. And we at Antony, which is definitely Nescent magazine, but we have been trying to do certain aspects of global literature by reaching out, by collaborating, by translating, and also by listening to our readers. So now that we have the opportunity here, I'd like to understand, do you follow the magazine? And is there any advice you have for the magazine that we can imbibe?
I have, the last 4 or 5 months, I've started reading the magazine, and I'm not extremely well versed in the full range of the articles, but I've just been absolutely thrilled by the range of tones that I read. The fiction, the nonfiction, the poetry, the essays. It's wonderful. I also like how global it is, how many different cultures I get to look into. I love all the translations from Bangla that I get to read, because I can't read Bangla. So it's a treasure trove for me. Just even the Humayun Ahmed or the Yashodhara, the story that won first place, I have never read these people before. I did not have that privilege because I have not had my hands on literature, so on the translation. So I have no advice to give. I'm starting to be a big fan, and I'm just incredibly grateful that for people like me who I feel like I know the culture very well. I speak the language with complete fluency. My vocabulary is not the best, but I can have entire conversations in Bangla. I'm sure there are many people like me. Kolkata is not just for Bengalis. There are many, many non-Bengalis in Kolkata who consider themselves as Bengali as anybody else, as part of the fabric. So I'm really grateful that this magazine is actually catering to us. There are large chunks of people like us, including second generation in America. I have a teenage son. When he gets older and he's curious about his background, these translations, especially translations that are good, that are literary, that appeal to his discerning senses. I'm really grateful for Antonym for filling that space, and I'm going to keep reading more, and maybe I'll have some advice, or maybe I'll just become a fan and I'll just keep reading.
Thank you so much, Chandreyee, for the nice words that you had for Anthony. And And with that, we also thank for the time that is spared today to talk to us and to our readers. Thank you so much, and continue translating. Thank you.
I will try. Thank you so much.